Hello, everybody. It's Miss Glonico, and we are going to be starting Unit 7 today by talking about the Industrial Revolution, which is topic 7.1. And we'll be getting going with SPS 6A1, which is really focused on the beginnings of industrialization. And as you can see from the map, the Industrial Revolution started in England. Great Britain as a whole is kind of considered that starting point. And basically, what we want to know here is kind of the when and the where. So like I said, Great Britain is where it first started, the Industrial Revolution, which was the beginning of what we would consider to be like actual industrialization, although it's important to note that there was industry going on prior to this point, but not industrialization the way that we understand it in the modern sense of the word. So modern industrialization starts with the Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 1700s. And that's when the very first innovations that led to the Industrial Revolution really get going. But it didn't start having a major impact and become what we consider the Industrial Revolution to be, with factories and big cities and all that sort of jazz and steam engines. That's kind of getting solidified by the 1830s, 1840s. And so prior to that point, we're seeing kind of all the lead up to it. And that's by the mid to early late 1800s, you're seeing the factory system, technologies, all that sort of jazz. Now, if you're like, what is the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution refers to the rapid transformation of the economy through the introduction of machines, new power sources, and new chemical processes in Europe and the United States between about 1760 and about 1830. And then from 1830 onward, we are seeing kind of the spread of industrialization to other places. Now, the Industrial Revolution is what shifts human culture and society and economy from being mostly rural and agricultural to becoming more urban and industrial. What's important to note, though, is that that really got started in Europe and then spread to other places, including the United States, Russia, and Japan. But other parts of the world didn't industrialize until much later, and there are some parts of the world that are only industrializing now. But we see a lot of the same kinds of trends that happen in different places around the world as they start to industrialize. Now, as far as how the Industrial Revolution gets started in the first place, we want to understand that new technologies are a big part of this, which would make sense, right? And we already kind of know some of that because we've looked at the Second Agricultural Revolution. We know the technology impact there. And what's important to note about the Industrial Revolution in Britain is that most of the early technologies were focused on textile manufacturing. Things like looms and mechanical spinners and water wheels that were being used to create water power from rivers and being able to operate machines using water power. And that led to the first textile mills. But the kinds of technologies eventually spread beyond textiles and into other industries and technologies. And just a few of some of those early technologies that were really important would include things like the spinning jenny, which was a machine that allowed one worker to operate several different spindles. And spindles are what you use to spin thread. And so instead of one person spinning one thread at a time, the spinning jenny allowed for multiple threads to be spun at once, all produced by the same person, which increases the volume of production. Then the water frame was introduced a bit after that. And the water frame was basically the spinning jenny, but on water power. And so it was kind of linked to the water wheels, which were, turning because of rivers. And then that creates power that then turns the machine, which then spins the thread. And now you're looking at even more volume because you can spin faster and the power is greater. So the overall thread ends up being tighter and stronger than the stuff that was made with the spinning jenny. So we're seeing an improvement of product as well. Eventually, steam engines are introduced, and steam engines made it possible to move labor and factories away from water sources, specifically running water sources, because instead of needing the power of a river to spin a wheel that would then power machines, now you can use a steam engine to manufacture enough pressure from the steam to move the machinery and make the factory work. So we start to see factories being established away from running water and wherever they wanted to be, as long as they were close to the types of natural resources they needed. And the steam engine was also then adapted for use in transportation, which led to the first railroads and steamships, which made it possible for people to travel further and faster than ever before. And it also helped to increase industrialization because it made it possible for manufacturers to get raw materials to their factories, but then also send their goods into the markets to be sold. and making those connections a lot easier and faster helped to spur industrialization even further. Eventually, what we see is a shift, because like early on, the focus was on coal power and iron and textiles. And then we start to see it shift away to other places, and we start to see, steam engines, and we start to see um, steel manufacturing and that sort of stuff, and also other kinds of mills and industry besides textiles. And that shift to steel made metal a lot lighter and more flexible, which meant that there was more innovations that could be reached. And then in the mid 1800s or so, a new chemical process made it possible to refine crude oil into petroleum products like kerosene, which was used for both fueling machines and also creating light, and gasoline, which, as we associate it, was something that powered the internal combustion engine. And we see the internal combustion engine first being invented in the 1860s and then improved again in the late 1870s. And then by the 1880s, we start to see the very first automobiles being created using the internal combustion engine and gasoline. And so we really start to accelerate the pace of industrialization as those innovations kind of build on each other and build on each other. Now, another thing that had to happen, though, was natural resources. And natural resources and their availability had a really big impact on what kind of industrialization you did, but also where industrialization happened. One of the reasons why Great Britain was one of the first places to industrialize was because of some of its political systems, but also its natural resources. You had to have access to things that could help fuel industrialization, which would mean you needed coal fields, and you needed iron deposits and timber and running water and human labor in order to make industrialization possible. As you can see from the map, it's really getting solidified by the 1840s in Great Britain and then spreading outwards through the rest of Europe. And we see something happening similar to that in North America as well. And this allows for industrialization to spread to other places. And oftentimes the industrial areas that would pop up as it was spreading were areas that also had a lot of coal and iron and running water as well, because that was the kind of technology that we had. Now, in Great Britain, coal had been part of like the culture, so to speak, for a while, and coal mining had been happening on a small scale. But as the industrialization process starts to increase the amount of demand for coal, especially with the steam engine, coal mining becomes a much bigger industry within Great Britain to keep pace with the demand. Typically, the parts of countries that first industrialized or were able to industrialize were the ones that had access to things like coal, iron, and waterways. And as we discussed in Unit 5, the second agricultural revolution was happening around the same time, which changed the way agriculture was accomplished and had the effect of improving food supplies, which then led to a reduced need for agricultural labor and also a growing population, which meant that you had more and more people who were able to work in factories, and you increase the amount of your workforce as a natural resource as well, which means that you have people that can work in those factories as they start popping up. One last thing, too, is that the climate of Great Britain was one that made it really ideal for the production of wool in past centuries, which meant that England and Great Britain had a textile industry already in place when the Industrial Revolution got started. So it was easy for them to kind of transfer some of that industry into a larger scale, but also into other kinds of textiles besides wool. So things like cotton and linen. All right, so I'm going to be back with you guys shortly to talk about our second EK. If you guys have any questions about this first one, let me know.